Since World War II, the United States has built an alliance system that spans 5 continents and over 3 dozen countries. Multiple bilateral and multilateral treaties signed by the United States and its allies have enshrined the concepts of mutual and collective defense in the foreign policy doctrines of America and its allies. Today, the United States is a member of NATO and is a party to the ANZUS and Rio treaties and the Compact of Free Association. Additionally, the U.S. has mutual defense agreements with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. These treaties have multiple purposes, including containing American adversaries and keeping allies with long-standing divisions united. All of the current mutual defense treaties between the United States and its allies were signed after World War II, but the roots of America's multilateral foreign policy go back much further to the 1820s. Early in the 19th century, America was not yet a global power, but the 5th U.S. President, James Monroe, gave a speech setting a limit for the European powers across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In his State of the Union address, Monroe outlined what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine stated that the New World was off limits to additional European colonization. In the 19th century, one goal of American foreign policy was containing European influence in the Americas. In the late 20th century, America undertook a similar goal of containing the spread of communism. The America that set up the Monroe Doctrine was very different from the superpower after World War II. Ironically, it was a European power that helped enforce the Monroe Doctrine. The British, wary of Spain regaining control of its colonies in Latin America, sent the Royal Navy to keep European rivals from re-establishing dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. Navy was not capable of enforcing such an expansive mandate, so the British did much of the work because they wanted to be able to trade with the Americas. The alliance was an implicit one because of the memory of the War of 1812 between the two sides, but it was an early example of America using its alliances to benefit its position on the world stage. After World War I, America had a very strong position globally, but the Great Depression severely harmed the American economy and gave rise to several powerful states, including Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the Japanese Empire. World War II would lead to victory for the Allies, but America was no longer the sole superpower. The Soviet Union, despite the devastation it suffered, was still the world's largest country with a very powerful military and a nuclear power by 1949. After the Suez Crisis, America's World War II allies, Britain and France, showed they were no longer capable of acting on their own. In 1956, after the Egyptians nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France invaded and tried to take control over it. The move was condemned worldwide, and the Americans and the Soviets forced Britain and France to withdraw. America, confronted with the powerful USSR in Eastern Europe and Asia, needed a way to prevent the Soviets from expanding westward and establishing hegemony in Europe. The problem was that Europe was full of many countries, and the Soviets could pick them off one by one. The solution the Americans developed was collective defense. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and several European countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO is a military alliance based on the doctrine of collective defense. Article 5 of the treaty states an attack on one NATO ally is an attack on all NATO allies. If a NATO country is attacked, it can invoke Article 5, and if all NATO allies vote to respond, then they will come to that country's aid. For the United States, looking to stop the spread of communism, collective defense was an excellent strategy because it imposed a very high cost on the Soviets. If the USSR invaded a NATO country, all of the other NATO countries would respond. As a result, the Soviets never invaded a NATO country. However, the first and only time Article 5 was invoked was after the Cold War ended. After the attacks of September 11th, the US invoked Article 5 and NATO formed the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, to fight the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Today, NATO consists of 29 countries in Europe and North America. NATO also unites previously bitter allies, with West Germany and eventually Germany joining the bloc, with World War II enemies Britain and France. Along with the European Union, NATO gives European powers the chance to cooperate instead of competing militarily. NATO's purpose was questioned after the Soviet threat dissipated, but since the USSR's fall, NATO has intervened in Eastern Europe to deal with conflict after the breakup of Yugoslavia and to protect Albanians from Serbian aggression. In the 21st century, NATO has conducted military operations in Afghanistan, anti-piracy operations off the Horn of Africa, and airstrikes in Libya. Today, the alliance often makes news over disputes between the US and the Europeans over military spending levels, but most Europeans consider the alliance important given Russia's aggressive actions, like its illegal annexation of the Ukrainian territory of Crimea. Moving eastward, the United States has mutual defense treaties with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. These treaties were also signed early in the Cold War to shore up American support in the region and stop the spread of communism. Today, as the Indo-Pacific region is now the most important region for the United States with the rise of China, these alliances provide a powerful check on China's foreign policy. During World War II, Japan and the United States fought brutal battles across the Pacific before the United States used 2 nuclear weapons on Japanese cities to force Japan's surrender. One would expect these countries to remain on hostile terms for decades, but something very different happened. Immediately after the war, the US military occupied Japan and undertook efforts to liberalize the economy and institute a democratic form of government. Women were given the right to vote, and Japan elected its first modern prime minister. The Japanese themselves also put a clause in their constitution making Japan a pacifist country without a military. The result of the Japanese and American efforts was a period of substantial economic growth after the war. Within the Japanese government, leaders did not want to rebuild the military in order to prevent Japan from becoming an imperialist power again. So in 1951, it decided to sign a mutual security treaty with the United States. In exchange for the Americans coming to Japan's aid in case Japan was attacked, the United States was allowed to maintain military installations in the country. Today, the American presence on the island of Okinawa is one of the largest the American military has stationed abroad. The treaty only obligates Japan to help defend Americans in Japan, not the American mainland. This is because the Japanese constitution forbids the development of a military. Only a self-defense force is authorized. After the end of the Korean War, which resulted in the political division of the Korean Peninsula, the US and South Korea signed a mutual defense agreement. The South Koreans also allowed the American military to maintain a permanent military presence in the country in order to discourage an invasion by North Korea. The Americans also placed South Korea under its nuclear umbrella, meaning it's possible the Americans would use nuclear weapons against the country at war with South Korea. Until 1991, the US even stationed nuclear weapons within South Korea. American protection is very important for South Koreans because of the threat posed by North Korea. The North has nuclear weapons and could without a doubt use them against its southern neighbor. What keeps them from doing so is the knowledge that the US would respond with nuclear force. Even if nuclear weapons were not used, the North has thousands of artillery pieces aimed at the South, and they are very well concealed in mountain bunkers. If North Korea used them and invaded with soldiers, the casualties would be devastating as the capital city of Seoul, with 10 million people, is just 35 miles from the border. During the Cold War, the American presence helped check the spread of communism, and today plays a role in keeping North Korea from developing long-range nuclear weapons and becoming an existential threat to the United States. In the event of a North Korean attack on South Korea or the United States, American forces with the South Korean military in South Korea would be the first to respond. Even though the American treaties with Japan and South Korea are separate, they nevertheless help bind 2 countries with a very troubled past. Between 1910 and 1945, Japan occupied the Korean Peninsula and used harsh tactics to maintain power. The South Korean-Japanese relationship still has its challenges today. Flashpoints occur on occasion, with one being visits to World War II memorials by Japanese prime ministers. Recently, South Korea threatened to withdraw from a trilateral military intelligence sharing pact with the US and Japan. The South Koreans backed down only after American intervention. Even though Japan and South Korea do not have the best relationship, American presence in the region helps 2 former rivals work together and focus on threats both countries face. Moving south, the US is also a party to the Australia-New Zealand-United States Security Treaty. Signed in 1951, the 3 former British colonies agreed to cooperate militarily and defend each other in the case of an attack. All 3 countries fought together in the Korean War, and the 3 got along for 30 years. However, a serious conflict arose in the 1980s between the US and New Zealand. In 1985, New Zealand banned any foreign naval vessel suspected of being nuclear-powered or carrying nuclear weapons from entering New Zealand waters. Since many American naval vessels are nuclear-powered or have the capability of carrying nuclear weapons, they were not allowed to transit New Zealand waters or dock at its ports. Additionally, the US will not confirm or deny the existence of nuclear material on any of its ships, so it faced a blanket ban from New Zealand. The ban attracted heavy media attention in the United States and caused the US government to call New Zealand, quote, a friend but not an ally. New Zealand was suspended from the treaty as a result. Today, New Zealand has resumed cooperation with the US and is still a part of the ANZUS Treaty, but it only allows American ships to visit if the government is confident there is no nuclear material aboard. Since it is public knowledge that all American aircraft supercarriers and submarines are nuclear powered, they cannot enter New Zealand waters. With Australia, American Marines are now stationed in Darwin along with aircraft. Both Australia and New Zealand participate in the biannual RIMPAC naval exercise led by the United States. It is the largest naval exercise in the world. Finally, all three allies are a part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Pact, along with the United Kingdom and Canada. Another mutual security treaty the U.S. has is one with the Philippines. The Philippines was an American colony from the end of the Spanish-American War until 1946, when it became an independent country. American troops were stationed in the country from the end of World War II until the 1990s. The end of the Cold War and domestic opposition to the American presence caused the Filipino government to ask U.S. troops to leave. They did, but in 2014, the two countries signed a new agreement called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, allowing American troops to be stationed on Filipino military bases, provided they receive permission from the government and do not bring nuclear weapons into the country. The Philippines has also been given the designation of a major non-NATO ally by the United States, and the treaty is still in effect. Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte has taken a softer tone on Chinese relations and a harsher one with American relations, but American approval among the population is much higher than China's approval ratings. Recently, Duterte said he would stop antagonizing the United States. A less well-known mutual security treaty is one of America's oldest and second only to NATO in terms of number of countries. The Rio Treaty, also called the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, is a mutual defense agreement between the U.S. and 16 other North and South American countries. The treaty has been tested on different occasions and has not performed well. In the 1982 Falklands War, many countries in the Rio Treaty sided with Argentina, but the US, Chile, and Colombia backed the British because Argentina was seen as the aggressor nation. The division within the alliance hurt its credibility. When the United States asked for assistance after 9/11, countries in the pact issued statements in support of the US, but only El Salvador contributed to the ISAF in Afghanistan. The treaty is still in force, but the main forum for cooperation in the Americas is the Organization of American States. The organization does not have a military component, but every country in the Americas is a member. The OAS focuses on election monitoring, drug trafficking, and human rights, among other issues. The final security agreement involving the United States is the Compact of Free Association. The CFA is a comprehensive relationship between the US, the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. The US agreed to handle the foreign policy in defense of all three countries, but it cannot declare war on any of the countries' behalf. All three countries gained access to many U.S. federal agencies like the Postal Service, FEMA, and the FAA. Also, citizens of the Pacific countries can live and work in the U.S., while Americans can also live and work in all three countries. The CFA is a unique treaty in that none of the three countries are U.S. territories, but they enjoy some of the benefits U.S. territories receive. The global alliance system the United States has built since the end of World War II has benefited both the U.S. and its allies. The U.S. government privately and publicly shames its allies to spend more on defense, and some allies do not support America's more unilateral actions like the Iraq War and the Iran nuclear deal withdrawal. However, America and its allies still recognize the importance of collective defense. Smaller countries like Poland and the Baltic states appreciate NATO because they would not stand a chance against the Russian invasion without American assistance. Even a nuclear power like the United Kingdom assumes its military will never again fight another war without the Americans. These alliances may have to change to adapt to changing geopolitics, but all sides know their importance and will likely work to strengthen them. If you liked this video, please tap the like button and subscribe. Thank you.